Welcome back to Koala Finance. For decades, Australia has balanced a delicate act, fueling our economy with Asian trade while anchoring our security to the United States. It was the best of both worlds. But in 2026, the cost of that insurance policy is skyrocketing. From the billion-dollar price tag of the AUKUS submarines to the way the US Federal Reserve effectively dictates our interest rates, Australia is drifting further into Washington's orbit. We are no longer just an ally, we are looking increasingly like an economic dependency. Today, we ask the controversial question, have we effectively become the 51st state? And more importantly, can the Australian economy actually afford the price of admission? For over 70 years, Australia's prosperity has rested on a delicate, unspoken geopolitical wager. We sell our iron ore, coal and lithium to the booming markets of Asia, filling our national treasury with the proceeds of the Asian century. Yet we outsource our national security, our cultural consumption, and crucially, our financial architecture to the United States. We have successfully played both sides of the fence, acting as China's quarry and America's deputy sheriff. But in 2024, that fence is being torn down. The signing of the AUKUS agreement, a commitment to spend up to $368 billion on nuclear-powered submarines, was not merely a defence procurement deal, it was a declaration of economic alignment. It signalled the end of Australia's strategic ambiguity and the beginning of a new, far more costly era. We are witnessing the solidification of Australia not just as a military ally but as an economic satellite. Effectively, the 51st state of the American Union, but without the voting rights or the protection of the US Treasury. The cost of this alignment is becoming visible in ways that go far beyond the defence budget. As the global order fractures into competing blocks, Australia is finding its economic sovereignty eroded by decisions made in Washington DC thousands of kilometres away. We see this in the weaponisation of the US dollar, the imposition of trade tariffs that ripple through our supply chains, and the relentless pressure to decouple from our largest trading partner, China. The lucky country is waking up to a harsh reality. Our economy is a small, open boat tied to the massive ocean liner of the US economy. When the US Federal Reserve aggressively hikes interest rates to tame American inflation, the Reserve Bank of Australia is forced to follow, importing economic pain to Australian suburbs to defend the currency. We are losing control of our own monetary destiny. The question this documentary seeks to answer is uncomfortable, but necessary. Is the price of our alliance with the United States becoming too high for the average Australian economy to bear? As we stand on the precipice of a potential global conflict and a confirmed trade war, we must calculate the true cost of our insurance policy. Because the bill is coming due, and it is being paid in the currency of Australian living standards. To understand the gravity of our situation, we must look past the headline GDP figures that politicians triumphantly recite during question time. The Australian economy is currently suffering from a severe case of optical illusion. While the aggregate size of the economy is growing, this growth is entirely artificial, a statistical mirage fueled by record levels of population growth. If you strip away the hundreds of thousands of new arrivals, the economic output per person has been shrinking for consecutive quarters. This is the per capita recession, a silent decline in living standards that every Australian feels at the checkout. Even if the national accounts don't officially register a crisis, we are effectively running faster on a treadmill just to stay in the same place, and the speed is increasing. Simultaneously, the cost of living crisis has mutated from a temporary post-pandemic spike into a structural feature of daily life. This is not just about the price of lettuce, it is about the stickiness of service inflation and the systemic collapse of the construction sector. Since 2022, thousands of Australian building companies have entered liquidation, crushed by a lethal combination of fixed-price contracts and soaring global material costs that are dictated by international markets we have no control over. This supply-side destruction exacerbates the housing shortage, driving rents to historical highs. Furthermore, our resource shield is cracking. The federal budget surplus hailed as a triumph of fiscal management, was largely a windfall from historically high commodity prices. As global growth slows, particularly in the manufacturing hubs of Asia, those rivers of revenue are beginning to dry up. We are left with a structural deficit, a crumbling construction sector, and a household sector carrying some of the highest debt loads in the OECD. The domestic foundations are weak precisely at the moment when the external geopolitical storm is about to make landfall. To comprehend the mechanism of this entrapment, we must visualise the Australian economy not as an independent island, but as a small vessel caught in a pincer movement between two colliding titans. On one flank, we have the People's Republic of China, which absorbs over 30% of our exports. In 2020, Beijing demonstrated the sheer scale of this leverage when it imposed punitive trade bans on Australian barley, wine and coal following a diplomatic spat over the origins of COVID-19. This was a kinetic economic attack, visible, loud and designed to coerce. It forced Australian exporters to scramble for new markets, revealing that our rivers of gold could be dammed at any moment by a political decision made in Beijing. However, the threat from the other flank, the United States, is far more subtle, yet arguably more pervasive. It operates through the weaponization of the US dollar, the global currency of trade and reserves. The US has increasingly used its financial hegemony as a foreign policy tool, deploying sanctions and tariffs to punish adversaries. For Australia, an ally deeply integrated into the US financial architecture, this creates a compliance trap. If Washington decides to sanction a Chinese entity that is vital to an Australian supply chain, Australian companies face a binary choice: sever ties with their biggest customer or lose access to the global banking system. We are effectively deputies in a trade war we did not start, enforcing rules that may actively harm our own economic interests. Crucially, this loss of sovereignty extends to our mortgage belts. The Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, likes to project an image of fierce independence. But the reality is that Martin Place is tethered to the US Federal Reserve. When the US fights inflation by keeping interest rates high, the RBA is effectively forced to follow suit, regardless of our domestic weakness. If the RBA were to cut rates to stimulate a slowing Australian economy, while the US kept rates high, the interest rate differential would widen, causing global capital to flee Australian bonds for American ones. This capital flight would crash the Australian dollar, sending the cost of imported fuel and goods skyrocketing and reigniting inflation. Thus, we find ourselves in a monetary straitjacket. We must import US monetary policy to protect our currency, even if it means crushing Australian households with higher rates than our domestic economy can actually handle. To measure the scale of Australia's strategic vulnerability, we must look to our peers. The most painful comparison is with Norway. Both nations are stable democracies with small populations and massive geological endowments. But while Norway treated its oil wealth as a volatile asset to be harvested for the future, Australia treated its mining boom as a permanent salary raise. Norway taxed its resources aggressively and funneled the proceeds into a sovereign wealth fund that now sits at over $1.6 trillion, effectively making every citizen a millionaire on paper. This fund acts as a national shield, insulating the domestic economy from global shocks. Australia, by contrast, spent its windfall on middle-class welfare and permanent income tax cuts. We spent our inheritance before we had even secured it, leaving us with a structural deficit the moment commodity prices softened. We chose the path of immediate gratification over generational security. But if Norway represents the path we missed, Canada represents the cliff we are approaching. Canada is effectively Australia's economic twin, a resource-rich nation with a banking oligopoly, a massive housing bubble, and a deep reliance on a neighbouring superpower. Canada is currently serving as the ghost of Christmas future for the Australian economy. They are further down the road of the productivity crisis, grappling with a standard of living that is rapidly falling behind the United States. This is the classic symptom of Dutch disease. As the resource boom drove up the value of our currencies, it rendered our manufacturing sectors uncompetitive. We watched our car industry die and our complex manufacturing wither, replaced by a simple dig and ship economy. Now, as the resource supercycle turns, we are left with a hollowed-out industrial base. We are a rich nation with the industrial complexity of a developing one, sandwiched between Uganda and Pakistan on the Harvard Economic Complexity Index. We bet the house on the mines, and in doing so, we forgot how to make anything else. The transmission mechanism from the marble halls of the US Federal Reserve to the weatherboard suburbs of Western Sydney is direct, brutal, and often invisible. For 2 decades, the Great Australian Dream was financed by a global era of cheap money. We imported deflation from China, cheap goods, and low interest rates from America, cheap credit, mixing them into a potent cocktail that inflated one of the world's most expensive housing bubbles. Real estate became more than just shelter. It became Australia's primary vehicle for wealth creation, a tax-advantaged asset class that earned more in capital gains than many Australians earned from their actual labour. This created a wealth effect where households felt richer and spent more, driving the domestic service economy. But this prosperity was built on a variable rate foundation that is now shifting violently beneath our feet. This reliance on property has created a systemic vulnerability that borders on the existential. The Big Four banks, Commonwealth, Westpac, NAB, and ANZ, are not merely deposit-taking institutions. They are effectively massive real estate hedge funds with a banking license attached. Upwards of 60% of their loan books are tied to residential mortgages. In the United States, banks are diversified across diverse industries. In Australia, the banks have bet the entire national balance sheet on the single proposition that house prices will never fall. This concentration risk is staggering. We have a household sector carrying one of the highest debt-to-income ratios in the world, hovering around 190%. This mountain of debt was serviceable when interest rates were near zero, but in a world where we must import higher for longer rates from the US to defend our currency, the mathematics of the mortgage belt are breaking down. We are now seeing the fixed rate cliff claim its victims. As hundreds of billions of dollars in low-rate COVID-era mortgages expire and reset to market rates that are triple the original cost, discretionary spending is being annihilated. Households are entering a zombie state, working purely to service debt, cutting back on retail, hospitality, and services. This turns the housing market from an engine of growth into a black hole that sucks liquidity out of the real economy. The tragic irony is that the Reserve Bank may be forced to keep tightening the screws, not because our domestic economy is overheating, but because our ally in Washington is running a hot economy that exports inflation to our shores. We are crushing our own middle class to maintain our peg in the global financial order. In the corridors of power in Canberra and Martin Place, the realisation has finally set in. The era of strategic ambiguity is over. We can no longer separate our economic partner, China, from our security partner, USA. The Australian government's response has been a frantic pivot toward economic sovereignty, embodied in the flagship Future Made in Australia policy. On the surface, this multi-billion-dollar subsidy package aims to revitalise domestic manufacturing in green energy and critical minerals. However, viewed through a geopolitical lens, it is effectively an integration mechanism into the US industrial base. We are pivoting from being China's quarry for steel to becoming America's supply depot for the critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, and rare earths essential for the US military and tech sectors. Under the Compact on Critical Minerals, Australian taxpayers are effectively subsidising the supply chains of the US defence industrial base, locking us tighter into the American orbit. We are diversifying our client, but we are not necessarily diversifying our risk. We are simply swapping one hegemon for another. Meanwhile, the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, is fighting a lonely war on a second front. The governor speaks of a narrow path to bring inflation back to target without crashing the economy into recession, but that path is becoming a tightrope walk over a canyon. The RBA is effectively trapped in a game of chicken with the federal government. While the central bank keeps interest rates restrictive to suck demand out of the economy, the Treasury is pumping billions back in via energy rebates, NDIS spending, and state-level infrastructure projects. We have the fiscal accelerator and the monetary brake pressed simultaneously. This policy incoherence creates a volatile environment where service inflation remains sticky for longer, forcing interest rates to remain elevated even as the private sector bleeds. The national strategy appears to be pray for a soft landing. But in a world where our biggest customer is slowing down and our biggest ally is exporting inflation, the landing gear may not deploy at all. The RBA is forced to keep rates high to defend the AUD against the US greenback, punishing Australian borrowers to maintain our standing in the US-led financial system. For the individual Australian investor and household, the geopolitical realignment we have described necessitates a complete rewriting of the financial playbook. For 30 years, the winning strategy was simple: leverage into residential property, ride the wave of falling interest rates, and rely on the China-fueled resources boom to keep the economy buoyant. That era of easy beta is over. In a world of structural inflation and geopolitical volatility, the set and forget mindset is a recipe for wealth erosion. The most dangerous risk-facing Australian portfolios today is home bias. We earn in Australian dollars, own Australian real estate, and have our superannuation heavily weighted toward Australian banks and miners. This is a concentration risk of the highest order. If the US-China rivalry intensifies, every aspect of your financial life, your income, your asset values, and your purchasing power takes a hit simultaneously. A robust survival strategy now demands true diversification. This means looking beyond the ASX 200, which is essentially a leveraged bet on banks and rocks, and allocating capital to global markets, defence, technology, and foreign currencies that act as a hedge against a depreciating Australian dollar. If the AUD is structurally destined to fall as commodity prices soften, holding unhedged global assets protects your global purchasing power. Furthermore, the logic of debt has inverted. When interest rates were near zero, debt was a tool for wealth creation. In a higher for longer world dictated by US Fed policy, debt is a wealth destroyer. Paying down non-deductible mortgage debt is now arguably the best risk-free investment available, offering a guaranteed tax-free return that outstrips most volatile market yields. Finally, in a per capita recession, your primary asset is your human capital. Job security is no longer guaranteed by national growth. The ability to pivot, upskill, and maintain income stability is the only true hedge against the rising cost of living. The game has changed from how much can I borrow to how resilient is my balance sheet. As the dust settles on our analysis, the question remains, is Australia truly becoming the 51st state? The evidence suggests that while we retain our flag and our parliament, our economic destiny is increasingly being written in Washington. We have traded the volatility of the free market for the rigidity of a geopolitical alliance. The AUKUS deal, the critical minerals compacts, and the synchronization of our monetary policy with the US Federal Reserve are not isolated events. They are the structural beams of a new architecture. We are building a fortress economy designed not for maximum efficiency or prosperity, but for security and compliance with American strategic interests. The era of the lucky country, where we could sell to everyone and answer to no one, is definitively over. This alignment comes with a heavy price tag. It means that the Australian economy will likely become more volatile, more expensive, and less independent. We will be subject to the booms and busts of the US economic cycle. And we will be on the front lines of any trade war the US chooses to prosecute. The true cost of the alliance is not just the billions spent on submarines, it is the loss of our optionality. We have locked ourselves into a path dependency where our prosperity is conditional on American power. If the US thrives, we may survive. But if the US stumbles, Or if its internal political divisions tear it apart, Australia is left exposed, a loyal deputy without a sheriff, holding a lot of expensive debt and very few friends in our own neighbourhood. Ultimately, the story of the Australian economy in the coming decade will be a story of wrestling with this reality. We are a nation caught between our geography and our history. Our geography places us in Asia. Our history binds us to the Anglosphere for 70 years. We managed to straddle that divide. Now, the gap is widening, and we are being forced to choose. We have chosen the United States. Whether that is a masterstroke of security or a catastrophic economic error is a verdict that history has yet to return. But one thing is certain, the days of the free ride are gone. The bill for our alliance is due, and every Australian, through their mortgage, their taxes, and their cost of living, is now helping to pay it. Have you noticed that while the politicians celebrate record economic growth, your grocery bill is harder to pay and your savings are shrinking? You are not imagining it. You are living through a per capita recession. In our next video, we're going to expose why the country is getting richer, but you're getting poorer. It is titled The Per Capita Recession: Why You Feel Poorer Despite the Growing Economy. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell because this is the explanation you've been waiting for.